Hey guys, this is AP World History, Chapter 25, Africa and the Atlantic World. Alright, so today's screencast will obviously pretty much be about Africa, but in addition to that, we're also going to look at the interactions that occurred between the Europeans and the Africans and how that really affected not only Africa, but also the Europeans as well in terms of the Atlantic slave trade. And it'll also look at how the Atlantic slave trade changed the demographics of Africa, changed pretty much the peopling of Africa. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to look at is African politics and society in early modern times. So this is kind of before the Europeans truly come in and exploit them. So it starts with the Songhai Empire and the Songhai administration. So this is the area we're talking about, the Songhai Empire. And the Songhai rulers built a flourishing city-state, and by the 15th century, which is the 1400s, it was pretty much the dominant Western power in the area. So we've already moved from the kingdom of Ghana, the kingdom of Ali. Those have deteriorated. Songhay will be kind of that last major kingdom that we see, and Sunni Ali will be the leader, and he'll build this very elaborate bureaucracy, this really centralized, organized government to kind of hold his realm together. He'll appoint governors to oversee the provinces. So those little cities in his kingdom that he can't reach, he'll appoint governors there to kind of rule in his behalf. They'll institute a hierarchy of command that turned his army into an effective military force. And that's really what he'll use to keep or quell any revolts that are occurring in his land. And of course, he will also create an imperial navy to patrol the Niger River. This was something a little different than the other previous kingdoms of Ghana and Mali. They didn't necessarily have a navy, whereas Sunni Ali decided to create one for the protection of the Niger. And this was an extremely important commercial highway in the Songhai Empire, so that's why it would make sense for him to want to create that navy to protect it. So the fall of the Songhai in 1591, a musket-bearing Moroccan army opened on the previously invincible Songhai military. So you have to remember, during this time, they do not necessarily have all the European military technology that is available, obviously, to Europeans. So limited military weaponry will hurt them and will lead to their fall. Songhai's forces withered under the attack, and the subject peoples took over the opportunity to revolt against the Songhai domination. So whoever was a slave in the empire, they saw, oh, well, they're getting attacked. This is going to be the perfect time to rebel as well. So this is going to result in a series of small regional kingdoms and city-states emerge in West Africa. So that'll be the last real empire that you see in West Africa. And it'll be just like it said, these small little kingdoms that develop. In terms of Swahili decline, and remember, Swahili is in East Africa. So just in case, this is the West over here, this side, this is the East. So this is the area we're talking about for the Swahili decline. So in 1505, Portuguese naval expeditions subdued all the Swahili cities from Sofala to Mombasa. So pretty much the European invasion is going to have a major impact on African societies. And the Portuguese forces will disrupt trade patterns in the area because they will, do what they want in the area and take what they want in terms of goods and commodities. Swahili city-states came into decline from which they never fully recovered. Because they never fully recovered, a lot of the times they will fall under colonial rule. So some of the questions to consider: know about the Sunni Ali and where he ruled. What areas did the Songhai emerge in? So moving on to the kingdoms of Central Africa and South Africa. So in kind of right here, South Africa, Central South Africa, or South Central Africa, we see the kingdom of Congo. And again, they built a centralized state with officials overseeing military, judicial, and financial affairs. So again, similar to the Songhai in that they had a pretty well-organized government. The Congo embraced much of the modern-day Republic of Congo and Angola. and the Portuguese merchants had established close political and diplomatic relationship with the Kingdom of Congo. So the Portuguese mariners, again, since they're the first explorers, they come pretty much establish this relationship with them. A very give and take relationship. In fact, I would argue that the Portuguese gave probably a lot more commodities in terms of wealth to the Kingdom of Congo than it was the Congolese giving to the Portuguese. But for the Portuguese, it was more about, not only exploiting the resources, but also taking the slaves. So they brought to the Congo, they brought tailors, shoemakers, masons, miners, and priests to the Congo. And in order to really solidify this alliance, this relationship that the Congolese had with the Portuguese, they converted to Christianity at that time, just to kind of show, true faith, true solidarity, and loyalty. So slave raiding in Congo. So the Portugal brought wealth and foreign recognition, like I said, to the Congo, meaning foreign recognition, meaning that they were on the map in terms of like Europeans recognizing them. And this will lead to the destruction of the kingdom and the establishment of a Portuguese colony in Angola. So kind of they got backstabbed in a way. You had this really good relationship with the Portuguese, and you thought, you're both staying loyal to each other, you're both being loyal. The Portuguese wanted more control, wanted complete control, didn't really want to have to deal with the Congolese. So they pretty much just destroy the kingdom and take over it and make it a colony, and they change it to the name of Angola. So the Portuguese merchants sought high value merchandise there in the area. They wanted copper, ivory, and most of all slaves. So it was kind of like, why are we still doing this interaction when I can easily take over you and take the goods that I'm already taking from you free of charge? So relations between Congo and Portugal deteriorated, obviously, and particularly after the Portuguese agents began to pursue opportunities south of the Congo in areas that they didn't already take over. The kingdom of Ndongo. This was a powerful regional kingdom, largely on the basis of wealth. It was able to attract. It was able to attract from trade because it offered, commodities like the copper, like the ivory. People they wanted to go there. And again, Portuguese. We see the Portuguese forces campaign in Ndongo in an effort to establish a colony that would support large-scale slave trading. So, if you couldn't already tell, yes, again, they want these nice commodities, but it's really the slaves they're after, and they're after these slaves because they have to take these slaves into the Americas to support their labor systems. So, know which was the best known principal kingdom in Central Africa, and what the Portuguese referred to as Ndongo as. So the kingdoms of Central Africa and South Africa were still continuing on that. We see Queen Nzinga, the Portuguese colony of Angola, and the Portuguese colony of Angola. So led 40 years resistance against the Portuguese colony. That's what Queen Nzinga did, and she was very interesting. She wasn't like necessarily a queen the way we think. She was more like a warrior, and sometimes dressed very manly. And she had the way emperors have concubines, like the several wives and the several women. She had that too. She had several men as well, and sometimes they would dress as women, these men. So she was always trying to fight off the Portuguese in the area, and she did it for 40 years. And she mobilized Central African peoples against her Portuguese adversaries. And like I said, her real goal was that she kind of wanted to make like the Central African Empire. That's what was her main goal. She wanted to get rid of these colonizers, get rid of the Europeans, and make this kind of one land of Central African Empire. So Angola was the first European colony in sub-Saharan Africa. And we see that again with the Portuguese. When Nzinga died, Portuguese forces faced less resistance in terms of spreading their colonies out in the area. And it resulted in extended and tightened control over Angola, because pretty much now we have nobody who's going to fight against us. We can pretty much do what we want. So in South Africa, kingdoms had begun to emerge as early as the 11th century and largely under the influence of trade. So in South Africa, regional kingdoms dominated political affairs, and by 1300, rulers of one kingdom had built a massive stone fortified city known as Great Zimbabwe. So we do see, based on this, that regional kingdoms did emerge in Africa, and some of them did survive outside of the Europeans trying to come in and control them. However, when the Europeans did arrive in South Africa, they struck an alliance with local peoples of South Africa in search of commercial opportunities. Again, the idea of trading. They intervened in disputes with the aim of supporting their allies and advancing their own interests, meaning, yeah, sure, we'll help you out, but what's in it for me if I help you out? So their conquests laid the foundation for a series of Dutch and British colonies. So again, like I said, the way in earlier chapters, how you saw the Spanish come into the Philippines, and that's why you have like the Filipinos have like Spanish last names. Similar here, we see the Dutch come in and the British come into South Africa, and that's why you see like white South Africans because of the colonies that were established during this time. So these colonies will become the most prosperous European possessions in sub-Saharan Africa. So the Europeans are going to colonize all of Africa, and we'll get into that much later. But this area will be the wealthiest of all of these colonies. So for know who Queen Nzinga was and why she was important. Okay, so that's pretty much the political side of Africa during this time. We see, one empire rise and fall. With Songhai, we see different kingdoms, like the kingdom of Angola, um, come and rise as well. But because of the Portuguese, they are going to decline because pretty much the Portuguese just want to take over and colonize. And we also see that in sub-Saharan Africa with the Dutch and the British also coming in. All right, so we're going to move on to the religious aspect with Islam and Christianity in early modern Africa. So Islam will spread all over in sub-Saharan Africa, and it was the most popular in the commercial centers of West Africa and Swahili city-states of East Africa. So again, Islam spreads all over Africa, especially in these commercial centers because most traders will be Muslim. So most African Muslims blended Islam with indigenous beliefs and customs, and it's going to create this syncretic Islam that really struck many who were very strict in terms of their devotion to Islam different. So very, very important is that Islam in Africa was probably the only place where it was different in terms of the way women dressed, different in terms of the way it was practiced. Okay, it was probably more laxed, meaning that it was probably more flexible and it adapted more to the native religion than it completely taking over as one religion. So people who are like from the Middle East and they come into sub-Saharan Africa and they see people who are also Muslim and they're not dressed properly, they're letting women have more control. To them it's kind of like, well, what's going on here? Why are you letting them act this way, behave this way? So it was kind of a shock to people who were not from sub-Saharan Africa who were Muslim. We also see this development of Fulani and Islam. They were Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa which had concerns about the purity of Islam. So many Fulani had settled in cities where they had observed a strict form of Islam, okay? And they had tried to do these campaigns to strengthen Islam in sub-Saharan Africa. Pretty much people trying to show African Muslims, hey, this is how we are supposed to behave. This is how we're supposed to dress. And it laid the foundation for new rounds of Islamic state building and conversion efforts. In terms of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa, we see it exist, not as dominant as Islam, but it is definitely there, especially in the East. And we also see it with the Antonia movement. So Portuguese communities in Congo and Angola supported priests and missionaries who introduced Roman Catholic Christianity to Central Africa. Remember that in this whole age of exploration, when the Portuguese are coming in and colonizing these areas, yes, it's about the gold. Yes, it's about, the glory and being the first to colonize here. But it's also about God, okay? And remember, it was that underlying justification, like, I'm going to use God to justify why I'm doing all these other terrible things, essentially. And so they had missionaries go into sub-Saharan Africa and kind of spread the word of Christianity and try to convert. So Christian teachings blended with African traditions and formed syncretic cults. So again, similar to what we see with Islam, how Islam blends in with the native religion, Christianity does the same thing as well. Okay? So they flourished when the Congolese monarchy faced challenges throughout the realm. And this is really when we see Christianity come in and, kind of gain more support. The Anatolia movement, this began when Doña Beatriz proclaimed that St. Anthony of Padua had possessed her and chose her to communicate his messages. So this is a time when we see the blending or more syncretic belief systems occur with this Anatolia movement. And she taught that Jesus Christ had been a black African man, that Congo was the true holy land of Christianity, and that heaven was for Africans. So kind of, switching Christianity to fit where you are. And we see this also with kind of the Sufis with Islam, how they're not all about like you have to practice it this way. They're just like, hey dude, as long as you believe, it's cool. All right, so know which religion was the most popular in West African commercial centers, and know what areas the Fulani established themselves. And know how major religions were impacted in sub-Saharan Africa, like the Antonia movement, know how that also impacted them. Social change in early modern Africa. We have American food crops in sub-Saharan Africa. Remember, we've already, old world, new world have connected. We're in the Americas and we're bringing stuff from the Americas back to Europe, back to Africa, back to Asia. So some of the things that we see, the trade brought new food crops to sub-Saharan Africa, like maize and peanuts. They arrived in Africa aboard Portuguese ships. This is obviously going to lead to population growth. Bread was made from manioc flour, had become a staple food in a lot of West African culture and Central Africa, and it helped to underwrite a steady population growth. So these American food crops supported expanding populations in all regions of sub-Saharan Africa during the modern times. So stuff we already know. When you bring in new foods, new food crops, it's going to enrich your diet, which will lead to population growth. All right, so now we're going to look at the Atlantic slave trade. Very important that you understand how this works. So this is the Atlantic slave trade right here. All three together make up the triangular trade. So again, pay attention. Right here, Atlantic slave trade. All three, triangular trade. So what ends up happening is over here in the Americas, we have these raw materials that are being taken and sent to Europe. In Europe, they're manufacturing these raw materials, like maybe they're using lumber and they're making furniture out of it, or they're making weaponry as well, but they're manufacturing goods. And then what ends up happening is that they will take some of those manufactured goods and take them down into Africa and sell them in exchange for, and trade them in exchange for slaves. And then those slaves will go back to the Americas and work in the labor systems there, whether it be, in the plantations, whether it be in the ingenio system, whatever it is in the encomiendas, they work over there. So that is the triangular trade. This right here is just the Atlantic part of it, the Atlantic slave trade. That's what we're going to look at. So foundations of the slave trade, we see slavery in Africa. So slaves in Africa came from the ranks of war captives. Remember that, and it's very, very important to understand that, like, the United States did not start slavery, okay? We were one of the last ones to end it, but slavery had already existed for many centuries in Africa. So usually they were war captives, they were criminals and individuals expelled from their clans. They fell into slavery. So once you're enslaved, you pretty much, you didn't have anything. You had no rights, you had no civil rights, and you were going to, work in the plantations like they did in the Songhai, and you often had hundreds of slave laborers. So Africans are enslaving their own people. Just keep that in mind. That's how it first starts. And Africans routinely purchased slaves to enlarge their families and enhance their power. That was a sign of wealth. The more slaves you had showed that you were more powerful, that you had more money. They assimilated slaves into their kinship groups so that within a generation, a slave might obtain both freedom and an honorable position in a new family or clan. So this is different than what we know as chattel slavery, okay? So chattel slavery is what we saw in America. That's considered chattel slavery. This slavery is almost like indentured servitude, where you're kind of working your way out of your debt or whatever. And if you were to do that, then you could probably be a part of a family or clan. We also see Islamic slave trade as well, and we see this before we see the American slave trade. So Muslim merchants from North Africa, Arabia, and Persia sought African slaves for the sale and distribution to their areas, pretty much in the East and the Middle East. The destinations were to the Mediterranean Basin, Southwest Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. So pretty much all of Eurasia. So by the time Europeans ventured to sub-Saharan Africa, traffic in the slavery was a well-established feature. Like I said, by the time the Europeans got here and wanted slaves, like, it was common. It was common theme. It wasn't like this totally new thing and, oh my God, the Europeans are terrible people. No, this already existed. So it's nothing new. A system for capturing and selling and distributing slaves had functions effectively for more than 500 years already. Like I said, nothing new. And the Atlantic slave trade brought an enormous involuntary migration that influenced the development of societies throughout the Atlantic Ocean basin. And that is new. The amount of people that became slaves was huge. I mean, millions and millions of people. So that displacement led to a population decrease, and it also led to other effects that you see in the Atlantic as well. So know who the earliest slave traders were and what part of the world they were located in. Know the region Muslim merchants traded the slaves. All right, human cargoes, again, having to deal with the Atlantic slave trade. So the early slave trade, traders delivered their human cargoes to Portuguese islands. So pick up your slaves, take them to your Portuguese island colonies in the Atlantic. Most of the time they worked in sugar plantations, and it called for slaves in increasing quantities because it's going to sound really bad, but I mean, they were dropping like flies. They were just, they were dying left and right because they were malnourished. They were working continuously. And it was cheaper just for them, they thought it was cheaper just to get a new slave than to keep one healthy. So you see them continually just purchasing slaves over and over again. In addition to that, the climate and them working in those conditions often created very unhealthy lives for them. I mean, you're like sweating in these really humid tropical environments, and you're working, more than 12 hours a day. So that also led to that increase of quantities of slaves. The Portuguese entrepreneurs extended slave labor to South America. And in 1518, the first shipment of slaves went directly from West Africa to the Caribbean, where they worked on recently established sugar plantations. Again, sugar plantations, the Portuguese sugar plantations were really super, super big in terms of having lots of slaves. The Spanish authorities introduced slaves to Mexico, and the English also used them to work on their plantations as well. But really, it was the Portuguese who probably had the most slaves, who used slaves the most. I remember the Mexicans, they did also, but they also had their mitad system, where they were, using natives to work in their lands as well. The English, they also used slavery pretty heavily, but they also had indentured servitude, where they had brought people over and they were paying off their debt through working in the plantations. So the Portuguese really, really, thought it was the best way to do business, I guess. So the triangular trade was the first leg. They carried horses and European manufactured goods. And then the Saharan Africans, we already talked about this. The Saharan Africans for slaves. The second leg took enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and the American destinations, and then the third leg they filled with vessels, hulls of American products, and embarked on their voyage back to Europe. So the main thing is that you know what was going where. Okay? So just keep that in mind that you know that. The Middle Passage, that is what they call going from Africa to the Americas. So after being captured, enslaved individuals were forced to march to the coast where they lived in holding pens until ships arrived to transport them to the Western Hemisphere. So pretty much they capture you, you're waiting for the ship to get there. The ship gets there. The dreadful Middle Passage refers to the transatlantic journey aboard filthy, crowded slave ships. I mean, you think of the worst, most horrible conditions to be in a ship, and that's what it was. Probably even worse than what you could imagine. You're literally on top of each other. You're defecating on top of each other. You're passing out and dying because you're suffocating. They just throw you over. So conditions were so bad that slaves attempted to starve themselves to death or mount revolts. That's how bad the conditions were. And ship crews attempted to preserve the lives of slaves, intending to sell them for profit at the end of the voyage, and they treated the unwilling passengers with cruelty and contempt. So one of those like, you're not going to die, you better stay alive, threatening them, that kind of thing. And approximately 25% of individuals enslaved in Africa did not survive the Middle Passage. So this was early on in this transatlantic slave trade, as they began to view slaves more as an economic commodity. Conditions got a little bit better, meaning that they weren't on top of each other. Maybe they got a little bit of food, to eat. It was just a little bit better in terms of the travel from here to there. And they did that because they realized, if I have more slaves alive when I get there, that means I'm going to make more money. So it wasn't that they were being humane with them, it's that they were seeing them as an economic advantage. Okay, so know what commodity European merchants traded for slaves? The impact of the slave trade in Africa. So, volume of the slave trade in Africa. The Atlantic slave trade brought about the involuntary migration of about 12 million Africans to the Western Hemisphere. Involuntary migration, meaning that they didn't want to go. Okay, they weren't like, yes, let me go, I want to leave. No, they were forced because they were bought. Kingdoms like Rwanda and Buganda escaped the slave trade partly because of the resistance and because their lands were distant from major slave ports on the west. So, if you were further in, deeper in, Europeans didn't want to waste their time trying to get to those slaves, and they pretty much left you alone. But if you were on the ports and you had your slaves ready to go, then that was something that the Europeans were interested in. Other societies flourished and benefited economically from the slave trade, obviously. Some of the social effects of the slave trade in terms of gender and slavery. The Atlantic slave trade deprived African societies of about 16 million individuals. Like I told you, major, major decline. In addition to this, several million others were consumed by continuing Islamic slave trade during the early modern era. So don't think that slavery is only happening with the Americas at this time. It's happening on both sides. Muslims are buying slaves, and Europeans are buying slaves to take to America. It's happening on both sides. The political effects of the slavery trade. Approximately 2/3 of all slaves were young men between the age of 14 and 35 years of age. They want the strong, the young to go because one, it's more money, and two, they're more likely to survive the journey. This resulted in a gender imbalance. Obviously, you're going to have more women who are in Africa, and it militated against slaves reproducing in most places in colonial America. They were not necessarily huge on that. It resulted in women making up more than 2/3 of the adult population in Angola. And what ends up happening is that these Angolans, they will embrace polygamy, where they have multiple wives, the whole sister wives kind of thing. So the practice of having more than one wife at a time. All right, so the African diaspora. And diaspora means like the spreading out, okay? The dispersal of African peoples and their descendants. So after they became slaves, and where did they go? What did they do? So obviously they went to plantation societies. They worked in the plantations that had cash crops. Remember, a cash crop is a crop that you can sell for money. So sugar was one of the most lucrative cash crops of early modern times, and then tobacco would come in second, and then rice became a major plantation product also, as well as indigo. So all these are cash crops. And by the 18th century, which is the 1700s, cotton and coffee will also begin to be on the rise in terms of cash crops. So that means you have all these different kinds of crops. That means you need people to work the fields. And what easier way than free labor? What easier way to make money for yourself than to have free labor? So the Caribbean and American plantations specialized in the production of some agricultural crop in demand, where African or African American slaves performed most of the labor. So some of the regional differences in terms of plantations in the Caribbean and South America, a lot of the slaves, like I told you, they're going to fall victim to tropical diseases such as malaria and yellow fever. Of all the slaves delivered from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, about half went to the Caribbean and about 1/3 went to Brazil. And only about 5% of enslaved Africans went to North America, where diseases were less threatening. So, again, the way I said, America, the colonists were not like taking all the slaves. Okay, definitely not like that. I mean, 5%, 5% out of 100, where are all the rest going? Just keep that in mind. A lot of them are going to the Caribbean. A lot of them are going to South America. A lot of them are going to the east, to the Asian area. There was resistance to slavery. Some form of resistance were mild but costly to the slave owners, and they knew this as well. And the slaves often worked slowly for their masters but diligently in their own gardens. So that was one of the ways that they could sabotage. I'm not going to work as hard for you, but you better believe that when I go to wherever you're going to place me to my house, I'm going to work hard in my area. Slaves occasionally sabotage plantation equipment or work routines, breaking work equipment, hiding work equipment, that kind of thing was going to set back the plantation owner. A more serious form of resistance involved running away from the plantation community, community maroon. So the maroons were known as the runaways, and they would go into the highlands or into the swampy lands, depending where they were, and they would kind of establish their own communities there. So, know the forms of slave resistance and which was most dramatic. Still with plantation societies, like I said, we see slave revolts also. This is the most dramatic form of resistance, was the slave revolt, and the slaves far outnumbered others in most plantation societies. So maybe you had like 20, plantation owners, the plantation owner and their family, and you had like 60 slaves there working for him. They had the potential to organize and overwhelm their masters. Only in the French sugar colony in Saint Domingue did the slave revolt abolish slavery as an institution, and we'll look at that later when we look at revolutions. So this revolt declared independence from the France and remained the land of Haiti. That revolution is what happened. That's the revolution I was talking about. Slavery and economic development. The physical labor of African and African American slaves made crucial contributions to the building of new societies in America. I mean, obviously they know they're not going anywhere, so they begin to develop, a blending of American culture with their own native culture. Slave labor cultivated many of the crops and extracted many of the minerals that made their way around the world in global trade networks of the early modern times. So they had a big influence on the worldwide economy. Slavery did. It wasn't just in their little plantation area, it was overall. Okay, so making of African American cultural traditions, African and Creole language, and African American religions. European languages were the dominant tongue in the slave societies of the Western Hemisphere, but you had Africans who also influenced their communities. Sometimes they would speak in a Creole language that the Europeans couldn't understand. Some slaves were shipped out of Africa, were Christians as well. Others converted to Christianity after their arrival in the Western Hemisphere, and they would blend their old beliefs with the Christian beliefs. So similar to the way that you saw it there in Africa. In terms of African music, again, we're going to see this blending. For many of these involuntary labors, playing of African music, it brought a sense of home to them. Like this is something that I can take with me wherever. It's not tangible. I don't have to worry about it. It's always with me. And slaves in the Americas adapted African musical traditions like rhythmic and oratorical elements to their environments, the callback kind of singing. And this was a means of buffering the shock of transition. Again, this is what's familiar to me. I remember this from home. This was also a way to survive and to resist the horrid conditions of their new lives. African American cultural traditions. Slaves introduced African foods to the Caribbean and American societies. They helped give rise to distinctive hybrid cuisines as well, like gumbo. Okay, that is a hybrid. And they also introduced rice cultivation to tropical and subtropical regions. And this is, of course, is going to add variety to the American diet. So the African diaspora influenced the way all peoples lived in plantation societies. So whatever I couldn't physically take, I'm going to keep, is really the idea of the African slaves and the African American slaves that were here. Okay, so the last slide, the end of slave trade and the abolition of slavery. We have Olada Equiano, um, was pretty much a freed slave and wrote about, the freedom he had. Some freed slaves contributed to the abolition cause. They wrote books that exposed the brutality of institutional slavery. That's what he did also. Most notable of them was him, Oladaquiano, and he published an autobiography dealing with the experiences as a slave and as a free man. So he knew both sides of it. The economic costs of slavery. Plantation slavery and the slave trade continued to flourish for as long as it could. As long as it was profitable, as long as you were making money, they were still going to have slaves. It wasn't about a moral issue. So slave trade did not come cheap, obviously. As the profitability of slavery declined, Europeans began to shift their investments from sugarcane and slaves to newly emerging manufacturing industries, meaning that um, once they were like, you know what? Oh, sugar's not making any money. People aren't buying so much sugar anymore. I don't know why we have all these slaves. We need to move to something else that's going to make us money. And for European countries, that was something that happened right away. Them shifting to the Industrial Revolution and finding industry as that new source of profit. For American plantation colonists, it was still a moneymaker. They were not just, growing sugar. They were growing tobacco. They were growing indigo, rice, cotton, and that was their moneymaker, still making money. So for them, it made sense to keep the slaves. And that's a reason why we were one of the last places to end slavery. So the end of slave trade and the abolition of slavery, the end of the legal commerce in slaves did not abolish the institution of slavery itself. So meaning that just because the government said we're ending slavery does not mean that everybody stopped doing it. So as long as plantation slavery continued, a clandestine or secretive trade shipped slaves across the Atlantic. Meaning as long as there was a need for it, it was still going to happen, even if it had to happen in secret. And then the last documented ship that carried slaves across the Atlantic arrived in Cuba in 1867. So slavery still occurring in Cuba. That was the last time that they shipped slaves. And officially, slavery no longer exists, but millions of people live in various forms of servitude even today. Okay, and you got to think, what is slavery? What constitutes slavery? All right, so the last things you need to think about, Elada Equiano, just the importance of this person, and know about the last documented slave ship. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Pretty long again, but this is pretty much talking about slavery, the effects of slavery outside and inside of Africa, and how Africans also, used religion inside, and how they made those religions of Christianity, Islam, kind of sync with their native beliefs as well. And then that final look at the empires of Songhai and the smaller kingdoms. All right, so we will see you guys next time.